Okay, so let's get started. Let's get started with today's lecture. Today I want to start off with some definitions. It's basically just we are taught that we know what we are all talking about, that we talk about the same kind of things. So very briefly, I walk you through what do we mean when we say there's a theory or what is a hypothesis. You know, it shouldn't be too much of a brainer, but we need to hammer that out so that we are all on the same page. Definitions are useful in that sense. And then I want to get started talking about how we actually do research. Yeah, and we call that the research process. The research process, different steps that you take. And again, it seems like something that is very straightforward, but remember we already had that a few times, that we thought something is very straightforward, but it turned out to be not that straightforward. Yeah. So that is sort of why it kind of helps to be clear about that and to think that through. And then I also brought some stuff with me about research design afterwards, but we'll come back to that. Yeah? But before I start, keep in mind, well, you all managed the first seminar. Congratulations, so last week, that was it. But the new assignment is already up. So you already find the assignment for next week when you have the next tutorial on Blackboard. Just as the last one. Yeah, so the new assignment is already up and you can start working on this. And as I said, these are the three things that I brought with me today. Definitions, just to hammer out a few things that we are all on the same page. And then the research process, and then I want to get started with what we call research design. After all, this lecture is called research design. So let's see what that is. Okay. First, some definitions. So I'm going to introduce some definitions in the case of an example. And the example that we had, you remember, we were thinking about this puzzle. Why do more Broadway shows receive standing ovations today than 20 years ago? We used that in the context of explanations, where I gave you a very general idea about how we can go about making explanations. It was this text by Jon Elster from Nuts and Bolts, from the book Explaining Social Behavior. He came up with this explanation. There's an increase in ticket prices, and that kind of leads to more standing ovations. Yeah? So now I'm going to revisit this example, but I'm going to use that to show you what is a construct, what is a concept, what is a hypothesis, and so on. Yeah? Okay, so that's out of the context in which I'm going to talk about the next few things. Okay, so what is a theory? Well, you have some idea what a theory is. Here's a definition of it. It's a set of interrelated concepts and propositions intended to explain and predict a phenomena. Yeah. Well, generally speaking, this is just a general idea about how things work. Now, that's sort of what a theory is. And there are ground theories, and probably you'll deal with a lot of ground theories. I'm not a huge fan of super ground theories because we can't really test them, we can't really prove them. In my opinion, often there's a bit airy-fairy in sociology, and I think we should do less of that. So instead, I think a good theory is something very tangible, but still abstract and general, so that it makes sense not just in one particular case. Yeah? So it's like a general idea about how things work. It's not just one particular thing, but it explains a lot of different things. And when you think back, in the case of the Broadway example, I mentioned this support from above, which is sort of like having a theoretical support for what we find. And in this context, we talked about this idea of cognitive dissonance, which is a much more general concept. It's more popular in social psychology, but it's relevant for us too. And cognitive dissonance is really this general idea that when there's a dissonance in your brain, about something that you see or something that you experience or something that you believe in, basically you have two different things in your head and they don't match with each other, right? They don't match with each other. Then you want to reduce that dissonance. There's a mental adjustment happening here, and that's a very general thing, you see. And we applied it, or actually Elster used it to explain increased ticket prices and standing ovations. People spend a lot of money for their Broadway show, for their ticket. They feel they need to get something out of it because they paid so much money for it. Hence, they kind of stand up and clap more in order to resolve the dissonance that they kind of paid a lot of money while in fact the show might not have been that great. Yeah. But that's a very general theory that we have, and people looked at it in very different areas. Yeah? But that's sort of what we mean with the theory. There's a set of interrelated concepts. Now I'm going to talk about what a concept is, but maybe you already see this, like this idea of mental readjustment. That's a concept. Or cognitive dissonance. That's a concept. Yeah? So now, concept, what is that? A definition. It's a generalizable properties or characteristics associated with objects, events, or people. Still very abstract. Yeah. You can, as I said, you can talk about internal dissonance, or mental readjustment. You see, this is by themselves, this is not a theory. Internal dissonance is not a theory. A theory is that internal dissonance leads to mental readjustment. That's a theory. So there you have these concepts and these constructs being related with each other. Yeah? That's sort of, as I said earlier in the definition of the theory, like a concept is sort of like a building block that you have in your theory. Yeah? Okay, and then you can narrow it down further. You can talk about constructs. What is a construct? That's something more specific than a concept. In the case of the Broadway shows, it could be being happy. Yeah? That people want to be happy in their brain, which is now in this case a more specific version of this, what this mental readjustment does. Yeah? It makes people feel good. They want to feel good. Yeah? It's a human thing, or that's what this theory suggested. This mental readjustment is happening, but you see how being happy is not necessarily all mental readjustments that there could be. Right? There could be different mental readjustments. So this is sort of like a more narrowed version of that. And now we are almost there. We're almost there with these definitions, because then you can kind of go down even further. You can go further down, and then we're talking about a variable. And a variable is a measurable representation of a construct. Yeah. What would it be in this case? Well, the percentage of people who stand up after a show. Right? You see how now I'm not talking about being happy or clapping. This is something measurable. And that's sort of what we mean with a variable. Okay, it helps to realize that these are different things. Yeah? So I'm not a huge fan of gas splitting definitions. I always think, what do we really get out of this? Yeah? I'm much more in favor of thinking what lies behind that. But the key here is that you see we have a theory, something very general that we have, and then we narrow this down through concepts or constructs until we have a variable, and then we're talking about different things, right? Okay, a variable, and now we can zoom out a little bit again. Now we can have a tentative or conjectural relationship between constructs. That's what we would call a proposition, something that we would deduce from our theory. For example, people who pay a high price for something justify the high price by thinking that whatever they bought is good. You see how that is different from the theory about the cognitive dissonance and the mental readjustment? Because now we're at the level of the concepts and the constructs. Yeah? And when you have that even lower down, when you have that on the level of your variables, then we're talking about a hypothesis. Yeah? That's an empirical formulation of a proposition with something that you can actually measure. And then you can, if you would plug that in, people who pay more money for a Broadway show are more likely to stand up. It's really just plugging now, instead of the constant into this, our variables in this. But you see how our hypothesis is now at this lower level, and the proposition is at the higher level, at the middle level, and the theory is at the above. Yeah? Okay. So that's a few definitions, also based on the readings that you guys had so far. but important that we are talking about the same thing. So when I say there's a hypothesis, or when I say there's a theory, that you know at which level we are talking about these kind of things. Okay. So much about some definitions that I wanted to bring up and have you guys being presented here. Now let's get started with the research process. Research process. Okay. Research process, it's basically, research process is how we go about doing research. You know, process means there are several steps in that. Yeah. It's almost like a recipe of things that you do. Almost like somebody telling you what you have to do when you want to do research. Yeah. And you know, I had classes like this where people told me about how to do research. I'm telling you how to do research right now. You know, I always find these things incredibly patronizing. Somebody telling you this is how you have to do it, right? And this is sort of what the rules are: do this or that, don't do this and that, right? Maybe you're used to these kind of things, but I find this incredibly patronizing. When somebody's telling me I just want to rebel, I just want to do things completely differently, right? So there are these rules. Sometimes it makes sense to say fuck the rules, or follow the rules first, and then you can say fuck the rules. And but there's actually a reason. There's actually a reason why these rules can be useful, and why it can be actually make a lot of sense to follow things. That doesn't imply that I think that you are stupid. You need to have rules to follow. I don't think that. Actually, I think the opposite. You know, actually last week I showed you we had this little crowd experiment, and turns out you guys are intelligent. But oftentimes it can be that something seems very straightforward, but actually it's not. Remember how we thought about, we know stuff. Remember how we thought about how we explain stuff. So rules can help you in this research process in order to get to making convincing arguments or making convincing explanations. Some people, they seem to defy the rules, or they seem to defy gravity. Good people do that. To be honest, I've only seen a handful of people that do that. So most of the time, when you kind of try to defy the rules, this is sort of what happens. It just rips you apart. So, and this is sort of what you end up with. You do some research project, and this is sort of what your finding is. So I think it makes a lot of sense to actually think clearly and be very precise in how you go about doing your research. After that, at some point, maybe you can define the rules, but for the moment, I would like you to follow these kind of steps. Okay. So when you have the research process, or when you do your research, three things to begin with. First of all, be organized. Sounds like a no-brainer, but believe me, I met lots of people. They were incredibly intelligent, but they were not organized. They didn't have their shit together. And that just really pains me because I see talent being wasted. So don't go there. Don't waste your talent by not being organized. Seriously. It's such an easy thing to fix, but it can really, really have a big difference. So I want you guys to live up to your full potential, be organized and be systematic. And it's an essential part in doing research. Yeah? Remember, we talked about systematic research, being scientific in how we go about things. Yeah? So being organized, documenting things, and being systematic in your approach. Another thing is focus. Now, when you do research, you need to be focused. You can easily get washed away. And I've seen that happening many, many times, where people have some ideas, they start doing some research, but they don't have a focus. So when last week I had some master students, now is the time starting to think about master's projects, it's still a while for you guys, but nevertheless, So the very first thing there is to really focus stuff. What do you want to do? What is sort of the thing that you're looking at? What is sort of the aspect of it? Because there's so many elements of it, right, that lots of people already looked at. You need to have a clear focus in what you're doing. What is your main story? So people can be great, they can be super intelligent, but if they don't have focus, when they don't have focus, they don't go anywhere either. Well, that's just a general about research perspective. Generally, I don't know. I highly recommend you to develop that focus. You're still at a stage, you know, in the first year at university. You're still allowed to not really know what you want to do or where you want to go, but keep that in mind. The earlier you can develop a focus, the better and the more successful you're going to be. Otherwise, you can end up. I don't know. Some friends of mine, they studied with me, great universities, and they didn't find a job afterwards because they had no fucking focus. Yeah? They just didn't really know what they were doing. They were all over. They were all scattered. Yeah? So you're still at a stage where you're allowed to not have that, but think about that and get started with it. Okay, but these are just some general comments about research and what is important in it. Let us now talk about this research process. Yeah? When we talk about the research process, we can split that up in 4 phases, or in 4 stages, so to speak. And all of these are part of the research. So when you do a research project, or when you actually read up an article where somebody has done some research, they've gone through these stages. And the better and the more precise you are about each one of them, the better and the more convincing is your research afterwards. Okay, so we have what we call an exploration phase, planning phase, execution, and reporting phase. So let me now dive into each one of them in a little more detail. First of all, exploration. So what is exploration? Well, you know, we already talked about questions. And getting a good question is incredibly important. And this is sort of where you set up your whole research, and the better your question, the better your research and your answer is going to be. And I would say it's the single most important thing to start research. Have a good question, and think about your question very clearly. Okay. But then during this exploration phase, there are also some other components in it. And to the literature, we will come back to that actually during the next session, during the next lecture. In the literature section, you think about or you look at what did other people already do. If you want to find something out about why there are more people standing up in Broadway shows, or why is the UCD food so bad, yeah, you go out, or why is there social inequality in Ireland? Why do men get higher salaries than women? You go out and you look at the literature. Yeah, that means you look at what did other people already do? What did other people study in this context? What did they find out? Yeah. So that's sort of one of the first things that you do after you have your question and you kind of have your idea about what you want to study. You go out and you look, did somebody already study this? And chances are that somebody already studied this. Actually, it happens all the time. You think you have this great idea, but somebody already studied this. Sometimes it's a long time ago, sometimes it's very recent, sometimes you're at the research frontier, but you need to do your homework, so to speak. And then you need to look at what did they look at in this context, and then think about, okay, how can I add something to that? So it's really like walking. We have this analogy, and I come back to that during the next lecture. We have this analogy of walking on the shoulders of giants. It's a quote by Robert Cambridge, or he uses it in the academic context, and it means like you build on existing work. You build on others. You don't have to reinvent the world. That's not how science works. This is not how the research process works. We make incremental improvements. We make one step further, and we kind of look at what did other people do, and then we make one step further. And then we look at what other people do and how do we fit in that. So it's about incremental improvements, and being very clear and very detailed in your literature search and review is crucial. Yeah? So that can be a lot of work. Some people find this incredibly exciting, some people like it. Actually, I kind of like to look up and kind of try to search stuff that I can find, hunt things down in the library or in journal articles and so on, and see what is out there and how the research landscape looks like. Yeah. Some people have difficulties with that. Oftentimes I see that some PhD students have difficulties with that at the beginning, partly because they didn't do the first thing first, because they didn't think about the good question, and because they are not focused and because they're not organized. Yeah. So that's why I'm stressing these kind of things, because they are important during this stage here already. Because otherwise you go out and you read and you get lost very quickly. And then at some point you knock at the door of your supervisor and say, Thomas, what am I going to do? I realize that I know nothing and that there's so much in the library, where do I start? Yeah? So the thing that helps here really is having a clear question, being focused, narrowing things down what you want to do, and then be organized and systematic about it. Yeah? So that's how the literature and theory comes into play here too during the exploration phase. Basically, theories can be useful to address your problem, and that's the way you should use theories. Some people use theories just for the sake of using theories. That's not good. A theory is at best something that we haven't proven wrong yet. Yeah. Think about that. That's sort of what a theory is at best. It's something that we haven't proven wrong yet. So use your theories in order to explain your question or to explain your problem. That's sort of where theories become very, very helpful. So again, a big mistake that people do, they write a literature review, they review existing theories, and they try to cover everything. Of course, they will fail with that, because there's so much out there. So instead, use the ones that are relevant, that help you to achieve what you want to do in this research, which is to make an explanation or to test a theory or to test an explanation. Yeah? So that's sort of this exploration phase. And it is this first phase because you haven't really written anything yet. You haven't really collected any data yet. You haven't talked to anybody else yet. You've just been thinking, you spent some time in the library, and maybe you wrote down some notes. Yeah. But it's a very important step. And sometimes this can take on for months or years before you actually go and do the actual data collection. So these are sort of the three things that you find in the readings about the exploration phase. I always have a fourth component. So whenever I do research, I have this fourth component, which is fooling around a little. And I mean that seriously. I mean that in the context that very quickly, personally, I get to a rapid prototyping stage where I kind of check if the kind of research design and the method that I want to have and the data, whether that is feasible, whether it's possible. It's like a reality check. Is this going to work out? Yeah. Because otherwise you can spend a lot of time, setting everything up, and then at the end of the day you realize you're never going to get the data. Or you realize you're never going to have the computing power to do a certain kind of analysis. Or you realize there's just something that you cannot ask people for whatever reason. Yeah. So that's why this, when you look at the readings, it's a very clear process often, yeah. But in reality, and that's speaking out of experience, and that's what other people in the business will tell you too. Very often we kind of check very early on whether what we plan is feasible or whether it's going to make sense to put more efforts into this. Yeah. And another reason why this is important I sometimes look at what do successful people do. Yeah? What do people who seem to have figured it out, or who are great academics, people who I admire, what do they do differently from other people? Yeah? And what I see is that very good people, intelligent people at great universities, yeah, they don't do things very differently than you guys. I think you can do exactly the same thing. I think you can do exactly the same amount of amazing work that people at some of the best universities in this world can do. The thing where people are often better is that they figure out at an earlier stage when something is not going to work out. It's not about that they have better ideas. or that they have more brilliant ideas. I think they are just faster in realizing when something is a stupid idea that they have. So don't be afraid of having lots of different ideas, but kind of get better in figuring out when something is not going anywhere. And that's sort of where experience comes into play, where sometimes people help you, or where I see where students sometimes struggle with it for months, and then where somebody like a supervisor comes in and tells them, listen, this is not going to work out. But that's sometimes hard to assess. But nevertheless, this fooling around stage I think is very, very useful. I do it actually a lot in my research at the beginning on. Okay, so that's exploration. So we kind of explore the scene here. Yeah? What is our question? What did other people study in this context already? What did they write about it? What are the theories that are relevant in this context? And is it potentially feasible to do what we have in mind? After that, after this exploration stage, comes the planning stage. So again, you haven't done anything yet. You haven't written anything down yet. You haven't collected any data yet. You're still at this phase where you're sort of planning a research. So this is this planning phase, and here you make the plan for your research. So you've done your homework, you figured out a question, you've done your literature homework, you looked at the theories that are out there. Now you're in this planning stage. And now there's something that some people call research design. Talk more about that later on, but it's basically like, okay, how do we set up things? Do we have an experiment? Do we have a longitudinal design? Do we have a cross-sectional design? I will talk more about that. Then we have what we call operationalization. Operationalization is really just breaking these things that I introduced at the beginning of the lecture down to a measurable level. Yeah? You have your theories, maybe some other people have the theories. You have propositions made out of this. You're breaking things down to the level of variables so that you can then build up some hypothesis with something that you can actually measure. Yeah? That's what we call operationalization. You have something general and then you measure it. And that's also something where you see where some theories really suck because you can't operationalize them. And I think these are bad theories when you can't capture what they intended to describe. So that's operationalization, and then you can choose a method. We'll talk much more about these things. So I'm going to zoom in on different aspects of this. The rest of the course and the term, you can decide to have a survey. You can decide to have focus groups. You can decide to have ethnographies. You can decide to collect data in all sorts of ways. Yeah? Have all sorts of ways of then analyzing that data as well. So that's sort of the general decision about how you go about that. That's what we call the method. And then oftentimes we cannot study a whole population, or we can study everybody. This is where sampling comes into play. So we'll also have 1 or 2 lectures about sampling, how you actually pick some people from this overall population or this overall pool of people that you're interested in saying something about, but you can't possibly talk to everybody, so you sample, you make a selection. And there are different strategies how you can go about that. Or the key is that you are systematic about these things, that you don't just run around and do some picking here and there. Actually, that's what we call a convenience sample, but that you are more systematic in this. So in all these steps, you can be very systematic. Yeah? And that's the point of being scientific in here, that you are systematic in all of these steps. And even in the first one, in the exploration phase, and how you have your question, then how you go your literature, how you do your literature review, how you look at the theories that you have. And now in this planning phase, each one of these components, you have to be very systematic about how you go about it. Yeah. So that's this planning phase. We'll come back to different aspects of this at different stages of this lecture. Now we are finally at this execution stage. So you see we had 2 big steps before that already. Before we go out and collect any data or analyze anything. And sometimes you can be very anxious to go out and get your foot on the ground and collect stuff. But think about these other steps first. Have this exploratory phase, and have this planning phase before you actually get to the execution. And even then, when we have an execution, we start with something that is called a pilot study. A pilot study has nothing to do with pilots. It's actually a test run. Yeah? Imagine I'm going to run a survey on all students at UCD. Yeah? I don't know how many, is it 20,000 or something like that? No idea. Thousands. Yeah? And I send out a questionnaire, but for whatever reason, I wrote my question in such a stupid way that people don't understand it. Maybe I understand it. Maybe the one person I talked with understood the question. But out of those 20,000 students, maybe there are 5,000 for whom this question just doesn't make sense, because it doesn't apply to them. Yeah. Or maybe, so that's one aspect of it, and we're going to talk actually in one lecture about this as well, about how you ask questions and the things that you need to consider here. But it might also be that it's just not feasible, that I don't know, I run an online survey and the server that I'm using is just not set up for dealing with 20,000 people. So if I would actually go for this study, it would fail. Yeah? The whole idea of this pilot study is that you don't screw this up when it matters. So that you have like a test run before, where you can realize what is working out, what is not working out. Because once you kind of go live and tell people, okay, click your way through it, and it fails, then the whole thing might be useless. Yeah. So that's where this pilot study comes into play. That's what we mean with a pilot study. It's basically a test run where you test your methodology, but also your research design, questions, practicalities of the whole thing. Okay, but then, now finally we are at this point where we are collecting data in whatever form. And as I said, there can be many different ways how you can collect data. And data is not just numbers, data can be text, data can be stories, it can be all different things that we need with data. It's just tangible evidence that we gather, that we collect. And you can be very creative in what you collect. It can be just results from a questionnaire, which is very, very useful, but it can be lots of other things too. Now, after you collected your data, then you analyze things. Yeah. And again, there are different ways how you can analyze stuff. You can do some statistical analysis with it, which is very useful, very helpful, very good to know. Well, actually, this is where the jobs are. So if you ask me about how you're going to get a job with this afterwards, this is how you're going to get a job afterwards. If you don't do that, it's sort of not impossible, but it's sort of it certainly makes your life easier if you know how to do these kind of things, if you know how to collect data, if you know how to analyze your data. That's what I don't know, companies, research institutes, or whoever or government often wants from sociologists at the end of the day. So, but again, there are sort of different ways how you can then analyze your data. Yeah. Okay, so that's sort of this execution phase, and now the last part. So you also need to write this up somehow. You need to report your results, and when you write something, actually, when you look at how research articles are set up, they have a very clear structure. There's an abstract, there's an introduction, then there's a literature review, then there's a method section, results, discussion, conclusion. When you look at, sometimes there's slight variations in that. But almost all good journal articles, they have this set up. This is how it looks like. When you ask me how a perfect essay would look like, for my second year students, I grade essays, or for you guys, I kind of grade the exam at the end of the day as well. Having a clear structure about this, it's half the battle. So when you're all over, it's just really hard to follow. So having a clear structure, what are you doing? What is this research about? What is the introduction? How do I fit this in the overall scheme of things? What did other people do in the literature review? What are you doing? How are you doing it? What is your data? What is your results? How do you make sense of your data? That's the discussion part. And then what do we learn from that? Or even what else do we need to do afterwards? What are sort of limitations of these studies? This is how you write a good paper. And then also dissemination. This is becoming more and more important. Here at the university, now we have to deal with impact, constantly being measured against impact. What the hell is impact? But it is important so that actually people hear about your findings, right? So that you can be that you can reach the people that should hear about your findings, or that you can communicate your findings. And that's very important. If you are not able to communicate something, you have a problem. Because how should anybody buy into it when you cannot tell them what you found or what this is all about in such a way that they can understand it? So, again, being clear, being systematic, being focused on these kind of things really helps here. Because it's something that people appreciate and then, I don't know, have a much better time in swallowing what you want to tell them. Yeah. Okay, so much about this research process that I started now. It was more in the readings. Yeah. You had that in the Sociology text. This was clearly outlined about the different phases. It's important to know them, and it's important to know that you don't just directly jump into doing some research, but that you think about it first, and that you are systematic in these different different sections. So some people, this can be really helpful to have a clear guide in what they should do and the steps that you should follow. Okay, so much about the research process. Let me get started with the research design part. I won't have time to finish this, but let me start this nevertheless. After all, this course is called Sociological Analysis and Research Design. So it gets to the research design. Let's get to that part. Okay, when you do the readings, I think I gave you a reading from Breiman, another reading from Sociology, where research design was covered. And maybe you've noticed that research design means different things for different people. Yeah. So in Sociology, page 21, he basically refers to this whole chunk of operationalization, method, and sampling as research design. That's how what is research design for Sociology. And these things are absolutely important to have that. I hope I convinced you that we need to be able to break things down. We need to be able to have a method, a way of being systematic about then collecting our data or then maybe sampling individuals from a wider population. Breiman has a slightly different definition of research design. So he refers to these 5 different things, like experimental design, cross-sectional design, longitudinal design, case study design, and comparative design. And he sees design as something different than the actual methods. Yeah? So for him, research design does not equal the research method. And in this case, actually, I'm following Breiman. So normally I actually like the Sociology book more, which is why this is the main reading. But here, actually, I like what Breiman is saying. And the reason for that is that you can use different kinds of methods for particular research design. So when you have, let's say, a longitudinal design, I'll come back to that in a second what it means. You do not necessarily have to do, let's say, a survey. You can do ethnographies and do this over time. Longitudinal basically means over time. And that you go back and do things over time. You can go and you can have a survey over time. You can go and have interviews over time. You can go and have ethnographies over time. The whole idea is that you keep coming back at things. That's sort of what we mean with the longitudinal design. In contrast to a cross-sectional design in a way. Yeah? So which is why I think now this design definition in Breiman makes a little more sense. So these are sort of these 5 research designs that we can have in different kinds of research, according to Breiman, or in social research. Often it fits into one of those categories. Yeah. And I think it makes sense to be clear about what they mean. Yeah. Okay, what is a research design? A research design is essentially a strategy, an approach to find out more about the subjects that you are looking at. You want to know more about them. And I have this example. Remember, I think in last lecture or the lecture before, we talked about this example. The children that watch a lot of TV are the most violent ones. Yeah. Now what I'm going to do, I'm going to start this now, and I'm going to continue that on Wednesday. I'm going to start showing you how these 5 different research designs would approach this suggestion. Yeah. How would we study this from an experimental design? How would we study this from a longitudinal design, from a cross-sectional design, and so on and so forth? And then hopefully doing that helps you to understand what the differences between these designs are. And then you also understand why Breiman means something different than pedagogy with design. Yeah? At the end, I don't really care about these definitions, whether you call this research design or whatnot, but you need to know these different ways of doing things. I'm never a big fan of hair-splitting definitions, because if you get to that point where you really have to debate and discuss, this guy said this and this guy means that with that definition, then maybe the definition is not that great to begin with. Yeah? So I think it's sort of like often like a useless battle that we have. So, but nevertheless, the content in it is important, and that's sort of why I'm siding with Breiman here right now, because I think the content that he has is very important. So one thing that I'm going to do, I'm going to talk about the experimental design on this particular subject. That children who watch most TV are most violent. That's what I'm going to talk about. And then next lecture I come back to that and I talk about the other four. Yeah. Okay. What is an experimental design? Well, you might have heard about experimental design experiments in the hard sciences, but actually in the social sciences we can do incredibly good and amazing experimental work. Yeah. And it's becoming more and more popular, even more so in sociology. You can do amazing sociological experiments. And why are experiments so sought after? Well, because they're very neat, because they're very straightforward, and they're very clear. At the end, an experiment is about a blue pill and a red pill. Now that's all there is. You have what we call a control and what we call a treatment. Some people get the control, other people get the treatment. And then you see what happens. And then you kind of compare afterwards the people that got the blue pill with the people that got the red pill. That's essentially all there is to an experiment. There are sort of more nuanced versions of that, and you measure the differences between the two groups first, and then you measure the differences afterwards again. That's like you measure something first, and then you do something, you have an intervention or the treatment, and then you measure it again. But at the end, it boils down to that you do something with one group, and you don't do something with another group, and then you look at the differences. Yeah? So experiments, what we do, we have random assignments of subjects. This can be people, it can sometimes be organizations, sometimes it's countries. Yeah? We have random assignments into treatment and into a control group. Remember the blue pill and the red pill. And then we test both groups before. Then we have something that we manipulate. That's what we call the treatment. While everything else is sort of the same. We test the two groups again, and then we look at the differences between these two groups. Yeah. Why is it so great? Well, there are some technical terms here. Unobserved heterogeneity dealt with by random assignment to groups. Unobserved heterogeneity means a lot of stuff that we don't really know yet. Unobserved, things that we haven't observed yet. Heterogeneity, differences between the people out there. Yeah. And all the things we do not observe matter both for the control and the treatment group equally. That's sort of the idea here. Yeah. So the only difference would be the red and the blue pill. Everything else, well, that's an assumption that we make, if our random assignment has worked out properly, everything else should matter the same way for both of these two groups. And because of that, because you can really look at, you manipulate something, and actually then you observe change afterwards. And so it even helps you in terms of getting towards causality. Like you do something and then something else is the consequence of that. So it cannot be the other way around. It cannot be a reverse causality. Yeah? There cannot be spurious relationships. There cannot be an omitted variable. Yeah? That's sort of why this is often the gold standard when we do research. Let me apply this now with our example of children that watch a lot of TV. So an experimental design, maybe you already see the difficulties with experimental designs here. There are kind of huge ethical issues. But let's say we could assign children randomly to the control and to the treatment group. And then we kind of look at how violent both groups of children are. And then we would force children in the treatment group to watch a lot of TV, while children in the control group watch TV normally. Now you see, this is sort of something that we now manipulate. Sometimes it's not easy to manipulate stuff. Sometimes it's unethical to manipulate stuff. Yeah? But this is sort of how the experimental design would look like. Yeah, you manipulate something. You have a treatment that you administer to one group but not to the other. And then you look at the differences. In this case, you would then test how violent children are after the intervention, and then you could calculate the group differences. And if you would find out that the children that you forced to watch more TV are more violent after you manipulated that compared to what they were before, compared to those other individuals that you didn't force to watch TV after compared to before, then you can be pretty certain that it's your manipulation, that it's kind of watching TV that kind of matters. And you do this post and or testing before and afterwards, because there could be general tendencies. Maybe just when time goes on, something will happen to everybody. That's sort of why you look at the differences. Yeah? Sometimes we also call this a difference in difference approach. You look at the difference between before and after, and you do this for both groups, treatment and control. And then you look at this difference. How much does the difference differ between these two groups? So that's sort of like the experimental design, and on Wednesday I'm coming to come back on the cross-sectional design, but let me give you the reading for Wednesday nevertheless. So the reading, well, you have it on Blackboard as well. Just as one text about literature search and literature review, and this is what we're going to talk about on Wednesday the next one. Okay, thanks guys.
Okay, so